Empire would have to deal with the settlement not of tens of thousands, but rather hundreds of thousands. And after Adrianople, it had to deal with hundreds of thousands who wanted settlement lands, but were no longer prepared to disperse or disarm. The West's inability to adjust to that new reality was one of the key reasons why, 100 years after that, the whole thing fell apart. But that is for another day. After pacifying the Rhine frontier, Probus then seems to have turned his attention back to the Danube, where he squared off and soundly defeated the Vandals. By this point, around about the early 280s, we begin to see a curious new sight. Soldiers engaged in public works and land restoration projects, which could only mean one thing. After nearly 50 years of constant warfare, the legions were running out of enemies to fight. Just a decade before, Aurelian had been unable to spare a single soldier to help build his walls around Rome. Walls that were finished right at the outset of Probus's reign, I should mention. But now, we have reports of soldiers digging irrigation ditches and planting vines, and yes, working on better fortifications for the provincial cities. The Sassanids were a significantly less potent threat now that Shapur was dead. The Goths had been beaten down to the point where they would not be a significant adversary for another century, and the power of the Franks and the Alemanni was being siphoned into the Roman tank. On the home front, sporadic uprisings were being choked off with ease, and for the briefest of moments, it seemed like the empire was at something resembling peace. It is even reported that Probus boasted that in a few years, Rome would not even need her armies anymore. Proud words, not to be taken literally, but unfortunately, it seems that some men in the army did take the emperor at his word, and they weren't too happy about Probus's vision of a less martial future. But don't get them wrong, they were no more interested in perpetual warfare than anyone else, but it's just that, well, if Rome no longer needs her armies, then they're all out of a job. And they liked their jobs. They were well paid and well fed, and had a degree of prestige that the poor provincial lives they had all left behind simply could not offer. That they were already doing backbreaking manual labor at Probus's order certainly did not bode well for their particular futures. That is, there wasn't much separating them from the civilians anymore. And according to the limited information we have, it was just this combination of unease about the future and annoyance with Probus's public works projects that led to the emperor's downfall in late 282. One of the main legionary garrisons in Probus's hometown of Sirmium had finally had enough of ditch digging in late 282, and throwing down their shovels, they rose up in revolt. It is difficult to follow the chain of events, but it seems that Probus had been in Rome celebrating a triumph, and that he was on his way back to the frontier zone, possibly to get Aurelian's planned eastern campaign restarted, when news of the revolt reached him. Eventually, the troops in Sirmium would elevate a praetorian prefect by the name of Marcus Aurelius Carus to the throne, but it is unclear whether this occurred in conjunction with the original revolt, or whether it only occurred after Probus had been dispatched with. The bottom line, though, is that Probus arrived in Sirmium to restore order, found himself overwhelmed by the unruly troops, and was assassinated in September or October of 282 AD. He was 50 years old and had ruled the empire for just about 6 years. The murder of Probus, like the murder of Aurelian, was committed in the heat of the moment, and as soon as things calmed down, the soldiers came to regret their hasty violence. Carus, now donning the purple, had no trouble rooting out the men behind the assassination, nor any pushback from the rest of the men when he executed the murderers. The deaths of these two great Illyrian generals really served no useful purpose for the empire. They were neither tyrants nor incompetents. Quite the opposite. They were capable administrators and brilliant soldiers, who had done the yeoman's work pulling Rome from the depths of its misfortune. History and being as young as they were when they became emperor, it is not hard to imagine that had either one of them been allowed to rule into old age, that we might be dating the end of the crisis years to their ascension. As it stands, though, we still have a little ways to go. Though, with the elevation of Carus, we have basically come to the end of the line. The new emperor is going to elevate both his sons, Carinus and Numerian, to serve alongside him, and then he will march east to initiate the long put-off campaign against the Sassanids. While on campaign, he's going to die, and shortly thereafter, his son Numerian is going to die. And then, a general named Diocles will be elevated to the throne, and we can once and for all put the whole sordid 3rd century crisis behind us. Next time, we will close out the crisis of the 3rd century and bring to power Diocletian, the man whose passion for stability and order will lead him to overhaul the entire administrative structure of the empire, transforming it in ways that no man since Augustus had even dreamed of attempting. To say nothing of the fact that in a very short time, there will not be one emperor, but 4, and not rivals for power, but colleagues, working in concert to ensure the safety, survival, and prosperity of the renewed Roman Empire. I say next time rather than next week because the feast of the unconquered sun fast approaches, and the new year follows fast after that. I'll be traveling for the holidays and won't be able to get much writing done, so I'm going to have to take the next 2 weeks off. We'll be back, though, on January 9 to finally bury the crisis of the 3rd century, and then launch into the new age of the Tetrarchy, and then into Constantine and his newly minted Christian Empire. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with now over 80,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again, audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you will qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There's no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book download. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all your future audiobook purchases. This week, I am going to pass on a reader recommendation that is outside the scope of Roman history, Jack Weatherford's Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World, which is, by all accounts, a fantastic new biography of one of the most pivotal lives in the history of the world. So thanks to Charles for the recommendation, and remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 121, Phase 3 complete. Way back in episode 51, I talked about the generation of Romans who grew up during the factional conflicts of Sulla and Marius, spent their middle years embroiled in the political wars of the First Triumvirate, and, if they managed to survive, they then died in old age, having just been dragged through 2 decades of civil war. It was a generation that knew nothing of the golden ages of Roman history that had come before them and would come after them. Theirs was a world where crass ambition and an indifference to the rule of law led to a series of compounding burdens that crippled them economically, morally, and spiritually. To wit, human life was cheap, and everything else was expensive. The men and women born during the late Severan period could relate. Their entire adult lives had been given over to the crisis of the 3rd century. Now approaching old age, they could look back on a life that had been filled by nothing more than endless war, political instability, plague, famine, and economic depression. Theirs had been a hard road, as hard a road as had been endured by the generation that had witnessed the fall of the Republic. But that road was finally, mercifully, coming to an end, just in time for them to die. I suppose that of some generations, much is asked. Not that anyone knew the hard road was coming to an end at the time. It would take a while before anyone realized that the Illyrian captain of the bodyguard who had just seized power was not just here to stay, but here to reshape, redefine, and restore an empire that had almost fallen apart completely. They didn't have the benefit of hindsight to help them clearly demark that before this point crisis, and after this point tetrarchy. We use arbitrary labels as a convenient way to help keep history straight in our heads, but we should never forget that they are just labels. To the Romans at the time, there was very little that would help them recognize that some corner had actually been turned when Diocletian came to power in 284. It was all just one long, continuous evolution, and no one really had any reason to believe that the ascension of Diocletian would turn out later to be some epoch-defining moment. Most probably thought he would reign for a few years and then be killed off like all the rest. But history has a funny way of working itself out. Sometimes scrawny 19-year-olds of no consequence turn out to be Augustus, and sometimes relatively undistinguished soldier administrators turn out to be Diocletian. Who knows how these things work? But before we get to Diocletian, we have to pass through the last mini-dynasty of the crisis years, and cover the reigns of Carus and his two sons, Carinus and Numerian. Marcus Aurelius Carus, or possibly Marcus Numerius Carus, had been thus a card-carrying member of that generation that had known nothing but toil and trouble. Born into a family of senatorial rank, Carus was of course insulated from some of the more abject deprivations endured by his less wealthy contemporaries. But still, Romans of every rank and class had to face a world that was not at all their oyster anymore. Carus had been born in Gaul, but educated in Rome, planting him firmly on the side of the old Roman aristocracy. And whatever his role in the assassination of Probus, it probably felt good to wrestle power away from the rough Illyrian generals and return it to the hands of a senator who at least knew who Virgil was. His career is mostly obscure, but we know that he had not yet received the honor of a consulship, despite the fact that he was approaching 60, which means that he could not have ever been particularly close to the previous imperial inner circles. But he was regarded enough by Probus to be named Praetorian Prefect in early 282, so we can probably trust that he was a capable administrator and solid soldier. As with the other beneficiaries of imperial assassination during this period, it is hard to tell if Carus took an active part in the plot to kill Probus, or whether he simply took advantage of the opportunity that presented itself once the deed was done. And really, we don't even know if he was hailed as emperor before or after Probus was killed. So was he a Machiavellian usurper who engineered the death of a man who had just named him to one of the most important positions in the government? Or was he a diligent careerist who was well positioned to be swept along by history? We'll likely never know. All we do know is that the Senate didn't fight the choice made by the Sirmium garrison, and none of the generals out on the frontiers who might have challenged Carus chose to fight him, and so in late 282, he became emperor of the Roman Empire. After dutifully punishing the men who